It was late October 2017, and I had just turned 28. I had decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. I lived in New Mexico at the time, and the vast, open spaces near the Mexican border seemed like the perfect place to escape from everything. Life had been stressful. Work was piling up, and I hadn't been taking care of myself. This was my way to hit pause and reset. I drove down south, past the small border towns and into the desert. My plan was to camp in an area about 15 miles north of the border. It was remote, quiet, and far from any main roads. The spot wasn't an official campground, but I'd read online that plenty of people camped out there without any issues. Besides, I liked the solitude. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was starting to sink low, painting the desert in hues of gold and orange. The place was as empty as I hoped. Just endless stretches of scrubby plants, rocky hills, and sand. There wasn't a single car or person in sight. I parked my car off a dirt road, grabbed my backpack, and hiked about a mile to find a good spot to set up camp. I found a flat area nestled between two low hills. It was sheltered from the wind and had a clear view of the horizon. Perfect. By the time I got my tent pitched and a small fire going, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the temperature dropped sharply. The desert gets cold at night, colder than most people expect. I bundled up, cooked a quick meal on my camp stove, and settled in to watch the stars. Out there, away from city lights, the night sky was breathtaking. I could see the Milky Way stretching across the heavens, and the silence was almost too loud. But as the night grew darker, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a faint unease, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. What could possibly be out here? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing over my shoulder, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the black, but there was nothing there, just empty desert. I laughed at myself for being so jumpy and decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. It was the kind of waking where you don't know what woke you, but something did. My heart was racing, and my ears were straining to catch any sound. At first, there was nothing but the wind rustling the brush outside. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of gravel. My blood turned cold. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was the deliberate step of a person. I froze, barely breathing. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night? I listened as the footsteps came closer. They weren't fast, but they weren't hesitant either. Whoever it was, they knew where they were going. I reached for the small knife I kept in my bag. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. My mind raced through every possibility. Maybe it was another camper. Maybe it was a border patrol officer. Maybe it was just someone passing through. But deep down, I knew none of those made sense. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, my fingers gripping the knife so tight my hand ached. Then, slowly, I saw a shadow pass across the thin fabric of the tent. The fire outside had burned down to embers, but it was just enough to cast a faint glow. The shadow moved deliberately, circling the tent. I could hear the person breathing now, slow, steady, almost like they were savoring the moment. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I couldn't. My body refused to move. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed, as the shadow stopped at the entrance of the tent. I heard the faint rustle of fabric as the zipper started to move. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The shadow lingered for a moment longer, then moved away. I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps faded into the distance. I don't know how long I stayed like that before I finally worked up the courage to move. When I unzipped the tent and looked outside, there was no one there. The fire was almost out, and the desert was as silent as ever. But in the dirt, I saw the unmistakable imprint of boot tracks circling my tent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there clutching my knife, my eyes darting to every shadow, every sound. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up my gear as fast as I could and started hiking back to my car. My nerves were shot, and every step felt like I was being watched. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief until I saw it. There was a black duffel bag sitting next to the driver's side door. My stomach dropped. I hadn't put it there. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. The desert was empty. Against my better judgment, I unzipped the bag. Inside, there were bricks of something wrapped in plastic. I didn't need to open them to know what it was. Drugs. A lot of them. Panic set in. Whoever had left this knew I was here. They had been watching me, maybe even since I arrived. I didn't know what to do. If I left it there, they might think I'd taken it. If I took it, I'd be caught with it. Either way, I was screwed. My hands were shaking as I shoved the bag into the back of my car and got in. I just wanted to get as far away from there as possible. As I drove down the dirt road, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. About 5 miles down the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A black SUV was parked on the side of the road. Its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I sped past it, my heart pounding. A few minutes later, I saw it again, this time in my mirror. It was following me. I drove as fast as I could, my car bouncing over the rough road. The SUV stayed behind me, not too close, but not far enough either. I didn't know what to do. If I stopped, I knew they'd catch me. If I kept going, I didn't know how long I could outrun them. Finally, I saw the faint outline of a border patrol checkpoint in the distance. Relief washed over me. I knew it was risky, but it was my only chance. I slammed on the gas and drove straight for it. The SUV stopped abruptly and turned around before it reached the checkpoint. When I pulled up, the officers immediately noticed my panic. I told them everything: the man at my campsite, the bag, the SUV. They searched my car, and when they found the drugs, their faces turned grim. They told me I was lucky to be alive. The area I had camped in was a known route for smugglers, and they didn't take kindly to anyone stumbling onto their operations. To this day, I don't know who the man outside my tent was or why he left the bag by my car. Maybe it was a warning, or maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, I've never been able to shake the feeling that someone is still watching me. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 32. I'd been craving a break from the grind of city life, so I packed up my old Jeep with some basic camping gear and set out on a road trip. I didn't have a specific destination in mind. I wanted solitude, quiet, and the chance to feel a little lost in the world. Somewhere in Nebraska, I decided to veer off the highway and take the smaller state roads that seemed to cut through endless fields and stretches of emptiness. After a full day of driving, I found myself in the middle of nowhere. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I passed a hand-painted sign for a state forest I'd never heard of. It wasn't on my map, but it seemed remote enough to be exactly what I wanted. I turned down a dirt road that led deeper into the forest. The trees thickened, and the sound of my tires crunching gravel was the only noise. Eventually, the road ended at a small clearing. It looked like a campsite that hadn't been maintained in years. The fire pit was overgrown with weeds, and a faded wooden picnic table sat under a leaning pine tree. This was perfect. I set up my tent and got a small fire going as the sun disappeared completely. The quiet out there was almost unsettling. No distant hum of traffic, no other campers, No sounds of life except the occasional rustle of leaves. I told myself that this was what I wanted, total isolation. As the night deepened, I sat by the fire, staring at the flames and eating a can of beans. The darkness beyond the firelight was absolute. I kept turning my head, listening, but there was nothing except the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of crickets. I crawled into my tent around midnight. Lying there in my sleeping bag, I felt the weight of the silence pressing on me. The forest felt different at night, more alive, like it was watching me. I fell asleep with my flashlight next to me, my hand gripping the handle of a small camping knife I'd brought along for no real reason other than a vague sense of security. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the inside of the tent was pitch black. I lay still, straining to hear what might have disturbed me. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze. The sound came from the trees just beyond the clearing. It wasn't consistent, more like someone trying to move quietly but occasionally stepping on something that gave them away. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps didn't sound random. They sounded deliberate, slow, like someone was circling the campsite. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The crunching stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard something else, a faint metallic clinking, like the sound of keys or tools. It was so out of place that my blood ran cold. I reached for my flashlight and knife, gripping them tightly. I debated whether to stay silent or call out, but the idea of revealing my exact location in the tent felt like a bad idea. I sat there in the darkness, my ears straining for any sound. The footsteps started again, this time closer to the tent. They were slow and deliberate, circling the perimeter. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, the footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Then, there was a sound that made my stomach drop, a soft, almost experimental tug on the zipper of the tent. I don't remember deciding to act. My body moved on its own. I turned on the flashlight and shouted as loud as I could, trying to make myself sound bigger and more threatening. I slashed the knife at the air, ready to fight whoever or whatever was out there. The flashlight beam caught nothing but trees and shadows. There was no one there. The sound of footsteps had stopped completely. I stood there, shaking, listening for any sign of movement, but the forest had gone silent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the dying fire, the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, scanning the darkness. Every so often, I thought I heard faint noises, branches snapping in the distance or the rustle of leaves, but nothing came close again. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I felt exposed, like something was watching me from the shadows. I didn't bother eating breakfast or putting the fire out properly. I just wanted to get out of there. Driving back down the dirt road, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing, watching me leave. But there was nothing. I drove for hours without stopping, putting as much distance between me and that forest as possible. Eventually, I pulled into a gas station to refuel and try to calm down. While I was paying, I mentioned the forest to the cashier, asking if they'd ever heard of it. They frowned and shook their head. "That road's been closed off for years," they said. "People don't go there anymore. Too many incidents." They didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I just nodded, got back in my Jeep, and kept driving. To this day, I don't know what or who was out there in the forest with me. Maybe it was just a random trespasser, someone looking to scare me, or maybe worse. I try not to think about it too much, but every so often, when I'm lying in bed at night and hear a faint noise outside, I remember the sound of those footsteps circling my tent, and I wonder if I should have stayed in the city after all. I never thought much about camping on abandoned farmland, but it felt like the perfect escape. I was 26, tired of the noise of the city, and in need of some silence and peace. I found this old farm out in the middle of nowhere, tucked away between rolling hills and dense woods. The place had been abandoned for years, according to the guy who sold me the idea. He mentioned the fields were overgrown and the barn was mostly falling apart. But the land was cheap, and that's all I cared about. The first day there was calm. I set up my tent near the barn, a good distance from the remnants of the farmhouse. The barn stood out, a large, weathered structure with a sagging roof and rusty nails that groaned with every gust of wind. The place seemed untouched by time. It was eerie, but that's what I was after, being alone with nothing but the wind and the sounds of nature. As the sun set and the sky turned pink, I started a small fire just outside my tent. The crackle of the flames was oddly comforting, a stark contrast to the absolute silence surrounding me. The only sounds came from the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds overhead. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. The night fell cold, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, watching the fire burn low. I didn't feel scared at first, not at all. I was alone, yes, but there was something peaceful about it. The sort of quiet that made you forget what it felt like to be surrounded by the noise of the world. But as the fire flickered down to embers, I felt it. A strange sensation creeping up the back of my neck. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, soft, distant noises. At first, it sounded like a low murmur, like someone was whispering. My heart jumped. I knew no one else was out there, but the noise grew clearer, and it was coming from somewhere near the barn. I stood up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. I strained my ears, listening hard. The sounds were faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, crunching on dry grass. I held my breath, staring into the darkness, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing. The air grew still again. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon or some other animal was scurrying about, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack, flicked it on, and shone it toward the barn. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement. The barn stood still, its weathered walls casting long shadows in the pale light of the moon. The wind picked up again, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I told myself it was just nerves, but the air had a strange weight to it now, as if it was holding something back. I sat back down, trying to shake off the feeling. I needed sleep, but sleep didn't come. I spent the next few hours staring at the dark ceiling of my tent, listening to the silence. It wasn't just any silence. It felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. The kind of silence that makes you feel watched, as if you're not truly alone. I could hear the faint creak of the barn settling with the wind, and it felt wrong, almost like it was breathing. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a jolt. The fire was out, and my tent was colder. It was well past midnight, and the air outside was crisp with frost. The strange feeling of being watched hadn't left, and now it was stronger, more persistent. My breath came out in clouds as I unzipped the tent, stepping out into the night. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the field. The barn loomed ahead, its silhouette darker against the sky. I scanned the area, hoping to see some sign of movement, anything that would explain the feeling gnawing at me. But the place was empty, too empty. Then I noticed something odd. The barn doors were open. I was sure they had been closed earlier when I set up camp. The doors were old, rusty, and difficult to move, but now they were wide open. I froze. My heart raced in my chest as I stared at the opening. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to stay away, to pack up and leave, but for some reason, I couldn't move. It was as if the barn was calling to me, beckoning me closer. I grabbed my flashlight again, its beam shaky in my hand, and slowly walked toward the barn. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stepped inside. The musty smell of old hay and wood filled the air, and I felt a pang of nausea. There was a layer of dust everywhere, undisturbed for years. But then, as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The far corner of the barn was different. The dust was disturbed, the ground marked with deep, claw-like scratches. I squatted down to examine it. The marks were fresh. I backed away quickly, my heart thumping in my chest. There was something out here, something I couldn't see. Suddenly, I heard it again, the footsteps. Only this time they were closer, much closer. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the barn. The beam caught a glimpse of something, movement in the shadows. I froze, my blood running cold. Something was there, just beyond the reach of the light. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart slamming in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back at my tent, breathless and shaking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me, just waiting. I stayed up the rest of the night, never leaving the safety of the tent. The noises didn't stop, but they faded after a while. The steps, the whispers, everything. I didn't sleep, didn't close my eyes, and when morning came, I packed up everything as quickly as I could. I haven't been back to that farm since. I don't know what it was that night, whether it was a person, an animal, or something else, but I knew one thing for sure. Some places are better left abandoned, and some things are better left alone. I never thought much about camping until I married Ethan. He was an Army officer who later transitioned into work as a special agent for a federal agency. Ethan was tough, capable, and always composed under pressure. His life experiences fascinated me, and I often felt like I was in a completely different world when he shared his stories. It wasn't until we went camping together that I realized his past didn't just make for interesting conversation. It was the reason I'm still alive to tell this story. It was the summer of 2019. Ethan and I had been married for 2 years. We lived in Colorado, a state with breathtaking landscapes. Ethan's idea of a perfect weekend was escaping into the wilderness. He believed being in nature was the best way to decompress. I'd always been a city girl, but I loved the way his eyes lit up when he talked about the outdoors. He picked a remote area in the San Juan National Forest. It was far from the usual crowded campsites, which he thought were too easy and didn't feel authentic. We packed our gear, tent, sleeping bags, a portable stove, plenty of food, and, of course, his favorite item, a small black duffel bag that he never went anywhere without. I knew it contained a firearm, extra ammunition, and some other survival tools, but I didn't ask too many questions. The drive was long, about 5 hours from our home in Denver. The last stretch was on a dirt road that twisted and turned through dense trees. There wasn't a single other car, and the further we went, the quieter it became. By the time we arrived, it felt like we were the only 2 people left in the world. We set up camp in a clearing by a small river. The spot was perfect, flat ground, easy access to water, and a beautiful view of the mountains in the distance. Ethan was in his element, setting up the tent and securing the area like he was back on a mission. I helped where I could, but mostly I just watched him, feeling a mix of admiration and unease. That first day was uneventful. We hiked, cooked dinner over the fire, and watched the stars. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being exposed. Ethan reassured me that we were safe, and I tried to believe him. The second day, things started to feel off. It began in the morning when I went to the river to fill our water bottles. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear any birds or rustling leaves, just the sound of the river. As I crouched by the water, I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I looked around but saw nothing. When I got back to camp, Ethan noticed my unease. He asked if I was okay, and I told him it was nothing. He didn't press, but I could tell he was more alert after that. We decided to hike to a nearby ridge for a better view. On the way, we found something strange, a campsite that looked abandoned. The tent was torn, and there were clothes and trash scattered around. It didn't look like an animal attack. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. Ethan examined the site carefully, his face serious. "Probably just careless campers," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe that. We continued to the ridge, but the uneasy feeling followed me. When we got back to our camp, Ethan did a thorough check of the area. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was on edge. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, or the lack of them. Around midnight, I heard it. Faint footsteps, just outside the tent. I froze, my heart pounding. Ethan was already awake. He put a finger to his lips and reached for his duffel bag. Slowly, he unzipped it and pulled out his gun. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, there was a soft rustling, like someone or something was going through our supplies. Ethan motioned for me to stay put and crawled out of the tent. I stayed perfectly still, my ears straining to pick up any sound. I heard him whisper, "Hey!" followed by the unmistakable sound of someone running. Ethan came back a few minutes later, his face grim. "It was a man," he said. "He took off when I confronted him." "Was he armed?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I didn't see a weapon, but we're not taking any chances. Stay close to me." The rest of the night was tense. Ethan stayed awake, keeping watch. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every sound made me jump. The next morning, we found evidence of the intruder. Some of our food was missing, and there were footprints leading away from the camp. Ethan decided we'd pack up and move to a different spot. We hiked for hours, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and whoever had been watching us. The new site was less ideal, rocky and harder to set up camp, but it felt safer. That night, I finally managed to fall asleep, but it didn't last long. I woke up to Ethan shaking me. "Get up," he said quietly. "We're leaving. Now." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my things and followed him into the darkness. As we hiked, Ethan explained that he'd heard voices, multiple voices, near the camp. He didn't want to wait to find out who they were or what they wanted. The hike back to the car was terrifying. We didn't use flashlights, relying on the moonlight to guide us. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. Ethan stayed calm, his gun in hand, scanning the darkness. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief. But as Ethan started the engine, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. We drove away without looking back. It wasn't until we were safely home that Ethan told me the full story. The voices he'd heard weren't speaking English. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were close, too close. He believed we'd stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see, maybe a smuggling operation or a drug drop. To this day, I don't know who those people were or what they wanted. All I know is that I'll never go camping in a remote area again. Ethan still loves the outdoors, but even he admits that trip shook him. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the figure I saw in the mirror. I wonder if they were just curious, or if they were waiting for the right moment to strike. I was 27 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I needed to clear my head after a messy breakup, and the idea of spending a weekend in the woods, far from people and distractions, felt like the right move. I chose a secluded campground deep in the Olympic National Forest in Washington state. It was mid-October, the air crisp and the leaves in full autumn colors, blanketing the ground in shades of red, orange, and yellow. The forecast called for rain, but I wasn't worried. I figured it would add to the peacefulness. I packed light, just a tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, and a small propane stove. My plan was simple: hike about 6 miles to a remote spot, set up camp near a stream, and spend 2 nights there. No phone, no internet, just me and nature. I left early Friday morning, parking my car at a small trailhead and heading out with my backpack. The first few hours were perfect. The trail was quiet, the only sounds coming from birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. I didn't see another soul, which suited me just fine. I passed a couple of signs warning hikers about the remoteness of the area, advising against venturing too far without proper preparation. I felt confident, though. I'd been hiking for years and knew how to handle myself in the wilderness. By mid-afternoon, the sky began to darken, and I could smell rain in the air. I picked up my pace, wanting to set up camp before the storm hit. After a bit of searching, I found a flat spot near a small stream, surrounded by tall pines. It was perfect. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and got everything ready just as the first drops started to fall. The rain came fast and heavy, but I was dry and cozy in my tent, listening to the rhythmic tapping on the nylon above me. I made a quick dinner of instant noodles and settled in with a book I'd brought along. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for. As night fell, the rain showed no sign of letting up, but I didn't mind. I zipped up my sleeping bag, turned off my headlamp, and drifted off to sleep to the sound of the storm. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from my sleep. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and the forest was eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was unsettling. I lay there for a moment, listening, when I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on wet leaves. My heart started racing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But the steps were deliberate, slow, and heavy, not the quick, erratic movements of an animal. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The steps stopped just outside my tent. Whoever or whatever it was, they were right there. I didn't dare move. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a ranger? Another camper? But why would they be out here in the middle of the night during a storm? I reached for the small knife I kept in my bag, gripping it tightly. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I didn't hear anything else, just the faint drizzle of rain on my tent. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a branch falling, or my mind playing tricks on me in the silence. I stayed awake for a while longer, listening, but everything remained quiet. Finally, exhaustion won, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, the rain had stopped, and the forest was shrouded in mist. I stepped out of my tent, stretching and taking in the damp, earthy smell of the woods. That's when I saw them, footprints. They were large, unmistakably human, and led from the trees directly to my tent. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been out there had come right up to me, stood there for who knows how long, and then left. The tracks continued past my campsite, disappearing into the woods. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it must have been another hiker who got lost and stumbled across my camp. Still, the thought unsettled me. I decided to stay alert but not let it ruin my trip. I spent the day exploring the area, keeping close to my campsite. The forest was beautiful, with thick moss covering everything and the stream gurgling softly nearby. By evening, I felt a bit more at ease. That night, the rain returned, heavier than before. I crawled into my tent early, feeling a bit on edge but determined to enjoy my time. I fell asleep to the sound of the downpour, hoping for an uneventful night. I woke up again, this time to a loud snapping sound, like a branch breaking. My heart pounded as I listened, and then I heard it, the same slow, deliberate footsteps as the night before. They were closer this time, circling my tent. I froze, clutching my knife. The steps stopped again, just outside. I held my breath, waiting, listening. Then came the sound of something brushing against the fabric of my tent. It was light, almost curious, like someone running their fingers along it. I couldn't take it anymore. I yelled out, hoping to scare off whoever, or whatever, was out there. The footsteps retreated quickly, disappearing into the rain. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. By morning, I was done. Whatever was happening out here, I didn't want to find out. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and started back toward the trailhead. The rain had turned the trail into a muddy mess, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. About halfway back, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Hanging from a low branch was a bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like a strip of fabric. My fabric. I recognized it as a piece of my rain jacket, which had torn the day before. My stomach churned. Someone had been in my camp, taken it, and left this thing. I didn't stick around to examine it. I pushed on, practically running the rest of the way. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my pack in the trunk and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in town, surrounded by people. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there with me. I reported it to the local rangers, but they didn't find anything unusual. I've gone camping since, but never alone. And every time I hear rain on my tent at night, I can't help but feel that same creeping dread, wondering if someone's out there, watching. In the summer of 2021, I decided to spend a weekend camping in a remote area of the Appalachian Mountains. I was 27 at the time, working long hours as a graphic designer in Atlanta, and I needed a break from staring at screens all day. My weekends had become monotonous, and I craved a bit of solitude. I found a spot online, a place called Raven's Ridge. It was known for its quiet trails and stunning views. The perfect escape, or so I thought. The plan was simple. Drive out Friday morning, set up camp near a stream, and hike the surrounding trails until Sunday afternoon. I packed everything the night before. A 2-person tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, a flashlight, a multi-tool, and my GPS. I made sure to download the map of the area to my phone since cell service was unlikely that deep in the mountains. The drive took about 3 hours. By the time I reached the gravel road that led to the trailhead, the sun was high in the sky, casting shadows from the dense pine trees that lined the road. I parked my car in a small dirt lot, grabbed my gear, and started up the trail. The first day was peaceful. The trail wound through thick woods, the air cool and damp. Birds chirped above, and occasionally, I'd hear the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush. I hiked about 6 miles until I found a small clearing near a creek. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, the water was close for filtering, and the tree canopy above provided decent shade. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered some sticks for a small fire. As the sun began to set, the woods turned quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I sat by the fire, ate a quick meal of dehydrated beef stew, and watched the flames dance until the sky turned pitch black. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sound of the creek trickling nearby, feeling content and refreshed. I woke up early, the morning light filtering through the tent. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore one of the lesser-used trails I'd read about. According to my map, it led to a ridge with panoramic views of the valley below. The trail was steep and narrow, barely visible in some places, but the hike was worth it. When I reached the ridge, I was greeted by a breathtaking view. The valley stretched out endlessly, with layers of mist hovering above the treetops. I spent a while there, just taking it in. It was exactly what I had hoped for when I planned this trip. By the time I started heading back, it was late afternoon. The trail back to my campsite felt longer, and I noticed how quiet the woods had become. It wasn't the pleasant stillness of the morning. This felt off. I kept stopping to listen, convinced I was hearing something faint behind me, leaves crunching like footsteps, but spaced out and irregular. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear. I had seen animal tracks earlier, and I knew these woods were full of wildlife. Still, the uneasy feeling stuck with me. When I finally made it back to camp, I felt relieved. I busied myself with collecting more firewood and cooking dinner, trying to shake off the strange vibe from the hike. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods turned dark again, and I settled into my tent. That's when I noticed something strange. About 30 feet from my tent, on the edge of the clearing, was a pile of sticks. It wasn't there earlier. It wasn't a random scattering of branches either. It looked deliberate, like someone had stacked them into a crude triangle. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Did I miss it when I set up camp? No, I would have noticed. Maybe it was just some other hiker who had passed through. But why would someone go out of their way to stack sticks like that? I decided not to dwell on it. I kicked the pile over, scattered the sticks, and went back to my tent. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, soft rustling, the occasional snap of a twig. Could have been animals, but my brain wouldn't let me relax. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something and jolt awake, my heart pounding. By morning, I was exhausted. I debated packing up and leaving early, but I didn't want to cut the trip short just because I felt spooked. I told myself I was overthinking things and decided to stay. I spent most of the day fishing by the creek, trying to keep my mind occupied. It worked for a while, but as the sun started to set, that same uneasy feeling crept back in. When I returned to camp, I froze. Another pile of sticks. This time, it was right in front of my tent. And there was something else. A small rock, perfectly round, sitting on top of the pile. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random. Someone had to have done this, and they wanted me to know. I looked around, scanning the trees, but I didn't see or hear anything. The woods were completely still. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, shoving everything into my backpack. I wanted to be gone before dark. I'd hike back to the car, even if it meant walking in the dark. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. About 50 yards into the woods, barely visible through the trees, was a figure. They were standing perfectly still, watching me. I didn't wait to get a better look. I grabbed my pack and started walking, keeping my eyes on the trail ahead. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention, but my heart was racing, and my legs felt like they were moving on autopilot. The hike back was a blur. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me whip my head around, convinced they were following me. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and the darkness closed in fast. When I finally saw the parking lot, I almost cried with relief. My car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. I threw my pack into the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, my headlights lit up the trailhead. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shadow slipping deeper into the woods. I didn't stick around to find out. I never went back to Raven's Ridge. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched the entire time I was there. I kept replaying the trip in my head, trying to make sense of it. Who was out there? What did they want? I still don't have answers. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I catch myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows, watching. I've always loved camping, but as I get older, I've started preferring quieter, less crowded spots. In the summer of 2015, I found a place I'd never been to before. It was a small, remote camping ground near the edge of a forest in northern Michigan. I stumbled upon it online, marked only by a few reviews and vague directions. That's what drew me in. The promise of solitude, peace, and the chance to enjoy nature without the sound of other people's radios or kids screaming in the distance. I packed light. I was only planning to stay one night, just me and my tent. The forecast said it might rain, but I didn't mind. Rain can be soothing when you're out in the woods. I left early in the morning, eager to get there and set up before the weather turned. The drive was uneventful, winding through small towns and eventually narrowing to gravel roads. I arrived mid-afternoon, and the place was just as quiet as I'd hoped. The campground was really just a clearing surrounded by thick forest. There were no amenities, no bathrooms, no water pumps, just a couple of fire pits and flat ground for pitching a tent. There were no other cars, no signs of life. It was perfect. I chose a spot near the tree line, close enough to the woods to feel sheltered, but not so far in that I'd get lost trying to find my way back if I went for a walk. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth, and I could hear the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. After setting up my tent, I walked around a bit, exploring the area. The forest was dense, the kind that swallows sound and feels much larger than it probably is. The trails were faint, more like deer paths than anything meant for people. I followed one for a while, just to see where it led, but turned back when I realized I was starting to lose track of where I'd come from. By the time I got back to camp, the sky had darkened. Thick clouds were rolling in, and the wind had picked up. I decided to skip building a fire and settled into my tent to eat the sandwiches I'd brought with me. The rain started soon after, light at first, then heavier, drumming against the fabric of the tent. It was cozy at first, lying there listening to the rain. I read for a while, then turned off my lantern and closed my eyes. The forest was alive with sound. The rain, the wind in the trees, the occasional creak of branches. It felt like I was completely alone in the world, cut off from everything but the storm and the woods around me. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something outside my tent. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was a distinct, deliberate sound, like someone stepping on wet leaves. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound came again, closer this time. I held my breath, straining to hear over the rain. There it was, a soft crunch, then another moving slowly around the edge of my tent. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Animals don't move like that, not in such a steady, deliberate way. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise. I clicked it on and pointed it toward the tent wall, but all it did was cast a weak glow through the fabric. Whatever was out there stopped moving. The only sound was the rain, now lighter but steady, and the occasional drip from the trees above. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Nothing happened. No more footsteps, no rustling, nothing. I told myself it must have been my imagination, or maybe the wind knocking something over. Eventually, I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, a faint crack, a whisper of movement, and my eyes would snap open. I started to feel trapped, like the walls of the tent were closing in. I thought about getting up and packing everything to leave, but the idea of stepping out into the dark, wet forest was even worse. Hours passed. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the forest grew quieter. I told myself over and over that I was overreacting, that I'd laugh about it in the morning when the sun was out and everything felt normal again. Then, just as I was starting to calm down, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. This time, they didn't stop. They moved closer, the sound of wet leaves and twigs snapping underfoot growing louder. My heart was racing, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I grabbed the only thing I had for protection, a small camping knife, and held it tightly in my hand. I didn't know what I'd do with it if something happened, but it was better than nothing. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, and I froze. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard the faint sound of breathing, low and steady, just on the other side of the thin fabric wall. I don't know how long I sat there, knife in hand, trying to keep myself from panicking. Eventually, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to close my eyes. When the first light of morning seeped through the tent, I finally unzipped the flap and stepped outside. The forest was wet and gray, and the air was cold and heavy. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But when I turned to look at my tent, my stomach dropped. There, carved into the fabric just above where my head had been, was a single deep slash, as if someone had dragged a knife across it in the night. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and left without looking back. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I haven't gone camping alone since.